rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Oh, come thou day spring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Oh, come, desire of nations, bind in one the hearts of all mankind. Bid thou our sad divisions cease, and be thyself our King of peace. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. I'm casting my cares aside, I'm leaving my past behind. I'm setting my heart and mind on you, Jesus. I'm reaching my hands to yours, believing there's so much more, knowing that all you have in store for me is good. It's good. Today is the day you have made. I will rejoice and be glad. Isn't it great that we can trust Him in everything, every single thing? Thank you, Jesus. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take Him at His word, just to rest upon His promise, just to know thus saith the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I've proved Him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. Oh, how sweet to trust in Jesus, just to trust His cleansing blood, just in simple faith to plunge me beneath the healing, cleansing flood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I've proved Him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. So I won't walk by what I see or what's been spoken over me that doesn't line up with your word written on my heart. And I won't worry, I will not fear, because I know that you are near. Whispering peace, be still. Whispering peace, be still. Whispering peace, be still over me. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I've proved Him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. And I'm so glad I learned to trust Thee, precious Jesus, Savior, friend. And I know that Thou art with me and wilt be with me to the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I proved Him o'er and o'er. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. So I won't walk. So I won't walk by what I see or what's been spoken over me has been spoken over me that doesn't line up with your word written on my heart. And I won't worry, I will not fear, because I know that you are near, whispering peace, be still, whispering peace, be still, whispering peace, be still over me. Hallelujah. Lord, may my prayer be set before you like incense. Lord, as we focus our attention on your presence that is with us, hallelujah. All the saints and angels, they bow before your throne, and all the elders cast their crowns before the Lamb of God and sing, you're worthy of it all. You're worthy of it all, Jesus. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. Sing, oh, 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 oh. Jesus. Just find a note, church, whether it be you're worthy, just sing you're worthy. You're worthy of it all, Lord Jesus. We sing to you a new song. You're worthy of it all, Lord Jesus. Oh, hallelujah, hallelujah. You're worthy, you're worthy, you're worthy of it all, Lord Jesus. Hallelujah. Day and night, Lord Jesus. Day and night we'll sing to you. Day and night, night and day, let incense arise. Day and night, night and day, let incense arise. Day and night, night and day, let incense arise. You're worthy of it all. You're worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. You're worthy of it all. You're worthy of it all. For from you are all things, and to you are all things. You deserve the glory. Tell him how much you love him. Oh, Jesus, I love you. Father God, I love you. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. How we love you, Lord Jesus. Hallelujah, Jesus.
Open your Bibles, if you will. We are going to be looking at a few of the Christmas texts. We're going to be in the book of Luke, chapter 2, as well as in the book of Matthew, chapter 2. First, we're going to start off in the book of Luke, and we're going to be talking a little bit this morning about breaking the rules. How many have ever found themselves guilty of being a rules breaker? All the time. I mean, I grew up thinking rules were meant to be broken. And then you try to figure out why you did it that way and try to figure out how to get out of the problem that you got yourself into. As a young man, and I know you probably don't believe this, but I, as a young man, got myself into trouble. I sometimes said things and sometimes did things that just weren't as appreciated as they might be. You know, it takes years of practice to hone a sarcastic attitude. Years. Because in the beginning, you just offend people. And you have to really watch people's faces and make a lot of mistakes to end up in a situation where you can say something and not offend people and still have a little bit of a sarcastic personality. I don't know anybody along those lines, but nonetheless, that's what I was told. It takes years of practice. But you know, in the Christmas story, we also have a lot of registry of people breaking the rules. And so this last week, I started to think about how many times the people in the Christmas stories were actually breaking the rules or the way that society said that they should act. And as I started to look at it, you know what? You can't rule out anybody. Everybody was breaking the rules. And you know, I like that. I like that. And so we're going to go to the scriptures today. And as I mentioned in Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 8, here's what it says. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger." Suddenly, a great company of the heavenly hosts appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said one to another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about." So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. When they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. Now here we have the text, and you're very familiar with it. Every Christmas season, every time you read through the Bible, you're going to come across this text. Is one of the favorite texts that you may have. And when we read it, we get all excited because Jesus has been born. We get all excited because the angels were celebrating. We get all excited because there were people that were doing what they were supposed to do. Jesus was supposed to be born. We have people that were excited about what they were doing. The angels were there to herald, to tell the good news about what God was doing. But there's this one sticky part in my spirit that I see. And maybe it's because I've had occasion to be a boss. And it's when the shepherds who are in the middle of doing their job decide to abandon the sheep. No, I just think about this. I think, poor sheep. The wolves that were out there at the time, they were all gathered around. I can just imagine. They had the wolf pack gathering, and they said, "You know what? We just heard angels. We saw all of the shepherds abandon the sheep. It's harvest time." Why do you think that the shepherds were out there? Were they out there protecting their own sheep? No, the majority of the time, and you could read through Scripture, it wasn't the owner who was out there, but rather it was a hired person. Perhaps it was the owner's child that would be out there to keep watch. And they had the job of watching over. Why? Because sheep had a way of wandering off, getting themselves in problems, falling into holes, getting themselves caught by wild beasts. If you go into the Old Testament, you hear when David starts to explain to King Saul that even while he's watching, he's had moments in which a lion or a bear would take one of those sheep, and he had to run after the lion and grab the sheep from the lion's jaws and beat the lion, beat the bear, and when they would turn upon him in defense, he would have to kill him. That was the story. That's what was happening. Now, I don't think that there was suddenly a reprieve. All of a sudden, the lions, bears, and wolves decided, we're going to fast tonight. I don't think so. So I have to wonder, what were the owners of the sheep thinking when they heard that the shepherds, it doesn't say they left a small remnant to protect the sheep. It says they all took off. What is wrong with these people? Don't they have a good work ethic? No, I'm serious. I was thinking about this. And they don't just go off. You know, if they started to make this as the new rule, at midnight when the owner is asleep, we can leave and abandon the sheep and we'll go into town. What are they going to go into town and do? Maybe they're going to go get a nice meal at a restaurant. Maybe they're going to go and do whatever. I mean, you know, this cannot start as a precedence. You can't start letting all of your employees just leave in the middle of their shift. That's why we have these rules, right? So I was thinking about how the shepherds broke the rules. And yet, here we are years later, and every one of you, you know that you're supposed to have a work ethic, that you can't just walk out on your job in the middle of the shift. And yet we read through the story and we say, oh, what a nice story. Jesus was born. And I think, I was thinking this last week, I think, poor owners of those sheep. And they were just abandoned, left out there for nothing. So what is it that we're finding here? It was their job to watch the sheep. Now, did the shepherds hear from the angels, now you'll find the babe wrapped in yeah, they heard that. Did the angels come to the shepherds and say, now what I think you should do is abandon your responsibilities, run into town, and do this right now? You know, I have to tell you something. When a baby is born, he'll probably be there tomorrow. Just last night at the Christmas party, we were talking to some other pastors, and they made a comment because they were watching Neto and Kathy and Melody as they were sitting at the end of the table. And one of the pastor's wives said, "Boy, she sure is well behaved," talking about Melody. And I said, "I think that's probably from my influence on her." I don't know why you're laughing. That wasn't the funny part. I said, I met her at 2 days of age. She was born, and a couple days later, finally she gets out of the hospital, and she's at Neto's parents' house. And we, Lori and Kaylee and I, we go to the family to be able to meet the new addition. This was obviously before Neto came to be on staff, but he was already a dear friend of ours. And so we go to meet Melody. And you know what? You can ask Melody next time you see her. Do you remember when Pastor Gary went and met you at 2 days of age? You know what she's going to say? No, she doesn't remember it. It's hurt my feelings too. But the child doesn't know that you came today or tomorrow. Am I right? I remember when my grandchildren were born. My parents wanted to come and meet their very first great-grandchild. But you know what my dad said to me? He said, I think we're going to wait a few months. Because a kid is just first born, the first couple of weeks, they don't do anything except for sleep. We want to wait because we're going to have to spend the money to go and travel. We want to be able to see a little bit of their personality. That's what he said. And so he waited. And he waited, and he waited, and he ended up seeing 2 great-grandchildren when he showed up, he and my mother. And so it's true. The older they get, the more they're doing, they're growing, they're able to do things. This morning, as Malachi, Elijah was in here, and Vince was saying, boy, over the last couple of months, he's just really advanced. He's doing so much more than he's done before. And I was just like, you know, I see him every day, but the way that Vince was going on, I looked over at Jerry, and I said, yeah, you should see the way he's playing the piano now. He grabbed, and he was doing some artwork. He did an exact duplicate of the Mona Lisa, and then when he started doing advanced trigonometry, we were shocked. You know, they're still kids. They're kids. Granted, he's above average. He's my grandson. But he's still a kid. And so I go back to this story of the shepherds. They hear something great has happened, but why is it that they have to leave in the middle of their shift? They went to Starbucks. You know, because if this becomes a standard, it's going to be a problem. Them always leaving and making up some other story. So that was one example, and we can go into the example in Matthew 2, and I'm going to get to a reason why. I'm not going to just leave you there. But in Matthew 2, in verse 1 and following, it says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now notice, this is afterwards. They don't feel like they have to show up the night of his birth. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all of the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. And so here we have another story. Now, in the days of the wise men, and these guys were the wise, they were the Magi. They knew what it was to be a foreign delegation. How many of you, this is going to be great, how many of you have ever traveled to a foreign country? Wow! 100%. In fact, most of you are right now in the foreign country you traveled to. When you came to the foreign country, you got across the border or got off of the airplane, and there is such a thing as customs. In Mexico, it's called aduanas. And when you go to aduanas, customs, you are going to have to fill out some paperwork. Why? Because when you come into a country, and if you were to go into another country, you will find it repeats over and over and over again. You have to come in. You're going to declare your purpose. Why are you here? They're going to say, what are your intentions? Why? Because they're going to be starting the process of giving to the majority of people a tourist visa. And if that person says, "No, I'm here to study," oh, that means you need a student visa. "No, I'm here to live." Oh, that means that you need, and they're going to move from one type to the other. And so one of the questions is always going to be, what is your purpose or reason to come into our country? And then they're going to say, how long are you going to be here? If you come in on a tourist visa in Mexico, you have a limit of 180 days, 6 months. But you have to get another type of visa if it's going to be a longer period of time. And so they're going to ask you when you're planning on leaving. Why? Because they don't want everyone who visits to stay. Just like I can ask you, do you want everyone who visits your house for dinner to just stay? And so they set up some rules. Declare before the customs where you're going to be and with whom you're going to be. And what happens? I remember the first times my parents were coming down. They were getting off the airplane, and they were so nervous because they didn't speak Spanish. And on the customs visa application, the top part, it says, where are you going to be? And so they're diligently looking for the exact address. They say, now what was his address again? And at that time we were living in Guadalajara, and we would move every 6 months or so. And it was difficult in the first few months, first few years. And so they would go, no, they don't live there anymore. They live over here. And finally, one of the customs agents, I remember them telling me, came up to them and said, just what city? Just what city? What city are you going to? And so the customs agents wanted to know approximately where you're going to be. And then when they said, we're visiting our son who lives in Mexico, okay, and that's what we needed to know. They needed to know the purpose, the length of stay, where they're going to be. But there's also one other thing that customs insists. They give you this little form if you're coming in on a tourist visa, or even if you're here permanently. They're going to ask you to fill out a form to register your exit. When you leave the country, if you're on a tourist visa, that little white card that you tear off, if you give that, they give that to you, and when you're leaving, you have to give that back to them. Why? That registers your exit. It's the same thing. Even if you have a permanent visa, you go to the airport, they're going to say, okay, fill out this form, go over to customs, and they're going to give you the form, and you have to give that form with your ticket to get onto the airplane, because you have to register that you are leaving the country. And this was the standard. It's a standard today, and it was a standard then. And so if you go back and you reanalyze the story of the wise men coming, they fulfill all of it right up to the very end. So let's go back. It says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Why did they come to Jerusalem? And they came and asked, where's the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. They went to the palace to register their coming in. This was what they were supposed to do. Now, granted, in that day, the commoner would travel and move back and forth, but when it was an official delegation, there were rules in which they had to obey. It wasn't, if some friend decided to travel across the continent and visit you, that person didn't necessarily have to go to the king and tell him, here I am, king, because they weren't of repute. They weren't of notoriety. But when there was a foreign delegation, they had the requirement of the same thing. They would come in to the king and say, here we are. Why was that necessary? Because anytime a foreign delegation would go into another kingdom, there was the possibility that they were there to spy. They had to register their coming in. They wanted to say what we're all about. And they come and they say, why are you here? What's your purpose here? Are you here to spy? Are you here to produce trade? What are you here for? And their answer, we are here because we saw his star rise and we've come to worship him. That was our reason. And they say, well, where are you going? And the king at the time calls in because they want to know, well, we're not sure. We just saw a star and we want to go. Well, that's something that you have to register where you're going. So the king calls all of the wise people, all of the teachers of the law in. And he says in verse 4, when he had called together all the people's chief priests, teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people. And so, this is what happens. He goes back, the king, Herod, goes back to the wise men, the Magi, and say, we're going to register you as going to Bethlehem. So what happens? Go to Bethlehem. But then he says something to them. He says, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Why did he need that? Well, they didn't know, but he was asking. Sometimes you go into customs and you don't even know why they're asking you questions. They ask you, well, did you do this? Did you do that? Or and you don't know what they're after, but they're getting some information. And this was evidently what was happening. And so they come back to the king, and the king says, now what time did you see the star rise? And it says, he found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. The rule is register your exit. Clear. When they came in, they got their visa, if you will, And they were told, here's the rule. Register your exit. You know what? If you don't register your exit, the next time you come in, you may have a problem. If you brought in a vehicle, you drove in, and you put a sticker on the windshield, and then you drive it back out of Mexico a few days, weeks, months later, and you don't register that that car has left, you know what happens? It stays stuck to that windshield, and now you sell it somewhere, in Idaho. You sell it in Washington. You sell it in New York. You sell that thing. And you know what happens? You come back and you say, here I am again. I want to bring in this car. And they say, no, you can't because you already have a car here.
Took me 5 entrances to try to get in, 3,000 miles.
Did I push a button for you there? They're going to deny the entrance because you didn't register the exit. And so the wise men, what would they be thinking? It's important for us to register our exit because we probably will want to take another trip. We're probably going to want to show up here again. So they know the rules. They go and they meet Jesus. They give Jesus the gold, the frankincense, and myrrh. And all of the things fall into place for them. And then here at the very end, it says in verse 12, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Uh-oh. We have more rule breakers. We have these group of people, and what's the deal with people who are constantly breaking the rules? You know what? I love them. I love them. And you know why? Because they're not just breaking the rules on a whim. That drives me crazy, honestly. People that we say, okay, we're going to start at this time. And you know, if you have a calamity at home, it was a one-time event, but there are people that they just habitually show up late. That's their rule. It's their rule. And you say, and I know people like this. There's people that we have relationship with that show up late everywhere. Everywhere. And so I will ask my wife when we're planning an event, I'll say, what time are we going to start? And she'll say, random number, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And so I'll go and I'll tell to the first person, we're starting at 4 o'clock. Because I know that person. Their rule is show up an hour late. And then I'll go and invite the other person because we're going to invite 4 people over. And I'm going to tell the other person, we're going to start at 4:30. Why? Because I know they're going to show up 30 minutes late. I'll go and I'll tell another person, we're going to start this whole thing at 5 o'clock. And they're going to probably be the first one there. Because that's their habit. How do you know when it's good and when it's not? Well, to break the rules. The things that are important in that day, when it was the sheep there, and the shepherds were saying, what? We need to go. There was a point when they had to say, is this worth breaking the rules or not? And with the wise men, the same thing. They had heard from the king, make sure you register your exit. You know the rules. But there was something evidently that came upon them that changed it. And it says, having been warned in a dream. How many have ever had a dream? Can you always trust your dreams? You know, there's times you wake up and you say, wow, that dream, I think, was because the spicy food I ate last night. Other times you wake up and you say, boy, I've really been having a problem with stress lately. But then there's other times when you say, wow, that dream was divinely appointed. And evidently something about the dream struck a chord with all of these wise men. You know what? One good clue that the dream wasn't just because of something you ate is when you dream something, you get up and you say, I had this weird dream. And your fellow wise man says, I had a dream too. And you start to match records together and you say, this has to be from God. Because we all had the same dream. Only God could do those kinds of things. And having been warned in a dream, all of them, the verb tense is very clear, all of them had been warned in a dream. So they decide that they were not going to go back. They were going to exit the country without telling the king. And so I have to say, good job. You broke the rules, but you did it for a reason. These were wise people. So how can we as a church know when it's time to break the rules? One of our texts that we read this last week in our Bible reading in Romans 12 is something you may even have memorized. In verses 1 and 2, it says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And so if you were to go to the shepherds and ask them, was it God's will for you to go? They would say, absolutely. But next week, when one of them says, I really, really would like some enchiladas. I really would like to go and just make a quick trip into the city. And you say, why? Well, it becomes a personal issue. And they know that this isn't falling into the same parameters. If the owner of the sheep come and they say, why did you do this? Why did you abandon the sheep? They would say, what would you do? If you saw a multitude of angels telling you, now, it just happened. You want to be the first ones there, don't you? They would be excited about it. And so even the owner, I believe, if they were to have been present, would have been running alongside of the shepherds. Same thing with the wise men. They had heard from God Almighty. And so they decide to break the rules. But the rules were not broken just on a whim. Here is what Paul tells the Romans. He says in verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world. The way the world wants you to do things. The pattern. Does that mean that we don't do anything the world likes? Does that mean as believers, we will never register our coming or our going with the aduanas? No, that's not what it means. But there are exceptions to the rule. You may have read stories about the Bible smugglers in areas where the Bible was illegal. To go into areas of China, for example. And you know what? At customs, these believers would have the customs agent say to you, do you have anything to declare? And you know what? They didn't say, well, just the 250 Bibles that we have. They would say, no. You know what? That is breaking the rules. Yay for them. Because they were blessed by God. They had been changed, and they weren't conforming any longer to the pattern or the rules set up by the world, not just because they didn't like it, but rather because their minds had been transformed, and their way of thinking had changed. And I believe this is what took place on that mountaintop, on that hillside, while the shepherds were there. They were awestruck. Angels were singing. It was something glorious. And you know what happened? Their thought processes were changed. They were different. And they looked to each other and said, we were just talking about who makes the best kind of veal dinner or lamb dinner or enchiladas or hamburgers or whatever. But you know what? All of a sudden our conversation has changed. Let us now go and see this wonderful thing that God has told us about. Everything is about God now. Because something happens when your mind is changed, your actions change. You follow through with what you think. You think about something long enough, you will follow through with it. You meditate on the good, and the good is going to follow through. You meditate on evil, and it's not going to be long before you do evil things. If you sit around and only think about how terrible your life is, how terrible the person is to your left or to your right, it's not going to be long before you are acting in a way that represents that person you think is terrible. But when we think differently, our attitudes, our actions start to change. And this is really what Paul is saying. He isn't saying that he wants you to learn how to be transformed in your mind. You know what? That's something that automatically happens. The angels didn't come to the shepherds on the hill and say, just 1 second, hold still because we're downloading a new way of thinking from heaven on you. No. Having an encounter with Jesus changes you. Changes you. This is why Paul would say what he said. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing. I think far too often the church gets their focus set upon that they need to try to have a transformed mind. You know what? You just start meditating on Jesus, your mind is going to be transformed. You don't have to try to sit around and figure out how to change your mind. What Paul is telling the church in Rome, and he's telling us, isn't how to be transformed, but rather to have that transformed mind now affect your actions. That you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, that you may risk it all. The shepherds were risking being dismissed, being fired, because they said, this is more important. Sorry, this is more important. The wise men were sitting there and they were saying, but we may never be able to come into the country again because we're going to be blackballed. We didn't register our exit. And they're going to say, it's worth it. Because they had been changed. They had had a transformation in their hearts. Why? Because all of this starts off in that text in Romans 12. It says, therefore. You know, I remember growing up, my pastor would always say, whenever you come across the word therefore, you have to ask yourself, what is it there for? It's there because in the previous chapter, in chapter 11, Paul has just come to this saying, and he says, all things come from him, through him, and for him. That's what he had just said. Therefore, present your bodies. Therefore, when we understand that everything proceeds from him and for him, it gives us structure on how to break and when to break the rules. Just like I started off saying, that a sarcastic person ends up offending a lot of people before they hone their talent. You didn't even know it was a talent. Before they get there, the same thing. While we are under the structure of knowing that everything belongs to him, that's the structure that we need to use in order to determine when it's right to break the rules. We're going to be rule breakers. When society says, be quiet, it's not right to use the name Jesus. You know what? We break the rules. When society tries to put us in a corner, and when society starts to tell us that what is wrong is right, and what scripturally we are told that you cannot do, this is a sin, and then society comes along and tries to poke its nose into the church and says, now, pastor, you can't preach on this subject. You know what? Society is wrong. And it's time to break the rules. I had a conversation just this last week, with a young man who told me that he had fallen into a homosexual relationship and wanted me to give advice. And I said, you know what? It's sin. Don't continue to put yourself in a temptation, in a situation. It's sin. And whatever is sin, the church stands up against. And it doesn't matter if the world starts to say, oh, it's alternative. This is being recorded. We have videos on the internet. Anyone can see this. Doesn't change the fact. Rules are to be broken when the rules are wrong. When we are under the structure of knowing that everything is for Him. You know, this is what Peter and John, they would say when they came along and they were told by the chief priest, they were told, you stop teaching in this name of Jesus. You know what they said? In verse 19 of Acts 4, it says, but Peter and John replied, which is right in God's eyes, to listen to you or to Him? You be the judges. In other words, our structure has changed. We've been transformed. Our minds have been in a relationship, had an encounter with Jesus, and now we are not prey to your persuasions. We are not going to fall before you. We have a new rule. We have subjected ourselves. Therefore, we presented our bodies as living sacrifices, because that's our reasonable act of worship. You do what you want with us. You know what? The world did. But they never apologized for it, because they were going to be rule breakers, because the rules were wrong. And this is who we are. We don't conform any longer to the pattern of this world, because we've been transformed. If you are still in a situation where you're not courageous enough to stand up and break the rules, Paul would tell you what he's saying here in Romans 12. Therefore, knowing that everything is under the structure of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Don't worry about yourself, because your mind has been transformed. Study, meditate, believe on Jesus, and very soon your actions naturally take form. And you'll know when it's time to break the rules. You would be one of those shepherds saying, sorry, sheep, love you, but I'm out of here. You'd be one of those wise men who say, my GPS shows me another way out of here. And you wouldn't be registering your departure, because you would know when to break the rules. We aren't just rule breakers because we like to break the rules. I know people like that. We're rule breakers because we are subject to another pattern of rules, because we've been transformed. I encourage you, allow Jesus to continue to transform your mind so that you will always know what His will is, how to act His good, pleasing, and perfect will. And then the world will be able to see there's a vast difference between us and them. When we don't conform, when we don't fulfill the society standards, we say things that you're not supposed to say. And we do things that you're not supposed to do. But you know what? We do it for a reason. We do it for a reason. Because Jesus has called us to give ourselves away. And these examples of the Christmas story were people giving themselves away. I'd rather see Jesus than have a job tomorrow, the shepherds were saying. I'd rather protect and obey. I'd rather protect this baby and obey God than to end well with this king. Where are you? Bow your heads with me, if you will.